Millions of people heard Jimmy Swaggart lecture about holiness and purity. The man behind the pulpit, however, was someone his family knew. For years, they saw him deceive congregations. They concealed scandals that were never reported. They are now speaking up following his passing. It has nothing to do with money or sex workers. It concerns an incident that occurred within the family. Something so awful that during his lifetime, they were unable to speak. Everything is altered by the affirmation they just provided. The darkest secret in the world served as the foundation for his empire. On March 15, 1935, Jimmy Swaggart was born in the impoverished Louisiana hamlet of Faraday. Minnie Belle and Willie Leon Swaggart, his parents, were poor Pentecostals who lived off the land. They occasionally hardly had enough food because life was so difficult. But that day, an odd thing occurred. Two more boys in the family were born at the same time as him. Mickey Gilly and Jerry Lee Lewis were born on the same day. They were all three cousins. Numerous cousin and relative weddings complicated their family. People murmured about the kind of background where shame and secrets lurked behind every wall. Some referred to it as incest. In the Deep South, others just referred to it as survival. Jerry Lee pursued rock and roll fame. Mickey pursued a career in country music. Jimmy, however, looked to God. He had no desire to follow his cousin's crazy course. Jimmy married Frances Anderson in 1952, when he was barely 17 years old. She was only 15. They quickly fell in love after meeting at church. They were married in a small ceremony the same year, starting a life full of faith and adversity. Jimmy made about $30 a week, working odd jobs to put food on the table. In today's currency, that is equivalent to $340. They lived in a dilapidated motel, borrowed cars, and a basement. By the middle of the 1950s, his cousin Jerry Lee was already earning $20,000 per week from Sun Records. But Jimmy refused to be famous. He refused to accept money. He accepted preaching. Jimmy's early years in the 1930s and 1940s were filled with starvation and terror. In order to make ends meet during the Great Depression, his father once operated a moonshine still. The family's land was raided by government agents in 1935, a few months before Jimmy was born. His uncles were aimed at with shotguns. Jerry Lee's father was one of them. Fearful, Jimmy's mother watched from her womb. Jimmy attended a segregated school and plucked cotton for pennies as a child. He witnessed a man being fatally murdered in the street in 1943 when he was 8 years old. He was broken by that moment. He wept for days. Jimmy was devastated, but Jerry Lee laughed it off. In the same year, Jimmy experienced a strong spiritual moment at church. He described it as giving him goosebumps. Without ever learning, he went to the piano and began to play. He thought he had been touched by God. He vowed to use his songs only for Jesus from that point on. When Jimmy was a teenager in 1947 or 1948, he and his cousins joined a gospel quartet. Despite their family's negative reputation in the community, they performed at neighborhood gatherings. Jerry Lee was already out of control and stealing. Jimmy played slots and sneaked into pool halls, but he was always plagued with guilt. He claimed to have heard God speak while praying when he was 12. He was instructed by that voice to preach rather than perform. In order to focus on ministry, even at the expense of poverty, he gave up his dreams of being a musician. Jimmy left school at the age of 15 in 1950. To make ends meet, he began pumping gas and operating trucks. He played the piano in secret at church. Jerry Lee, his cousin, was a musical phenomenon. Jerry Lee was making $20,000 a week by 1957. Jimmy, however, made a different decision. He started fusing his cousin's crazy rhythms with gospel. The outcome was electrifying. The churches were taken aback. It was reviled by some and loved by others. Jimmy purchased a $15 piano in 1952. With his meager earnings, he partnered with that piano to disseminate the news. He wed Frances that same year. She became his partner in everything, not just his wife. He passed away in 2025 after a 72-year marriage. They had nothing to begin with. In 1954, their son Donnie was born. Doctors weren't sure he would survive because he was unwell at delivery, yet he lived. Frances supported Jimmy through all of it, even the most trying times, such as his controversy in 1988. She oversaw their finances, encouraged his endeavors, and contributed to the construction of the family worship center. Jimmy recorded his first gospel album at the age of 20 in 1955. It was unadulterated, handcrafted, and potent. He sold roughly 5,000 copies after spending $200 to record it. At tent meetings, Frances assisted him in distributing copies. His music was unique, There was fire in it. It was energized. For God's sake, it had the sound of cousin Jerry Lee. He had 10,000 admirers by 1958. He nevertheless declined Sun Records' proposals. He put his faith before luck. Jimmy was only 23 when he was formally consecrated as a preacher in 1958. He traveled throughout rural Louisiana preaching with his wife and child. They lacked a reliable source of income. He used flatbed trailers to preach. There were times when the crowds were so small that it seemed like no one was paying attention. But he continued. His weekly income was a pittance. They ate whatever they could, slept in places they borrowed, and lived in churches. Despite having the opportunity to become wealthy like his cousins, he continued to preach. Jimmy took a big chance in 1961. From a small station in Baton Rouge, he launched a radio show called the Camp Meeting Hour. They were poor. To purchase airtime, he used listener donations and borrowed equipment. To stay afloat, he made records in improvised studios and sold them for $5. Although 200,000 people listened to his broadcast every week, by 1963, not everyone liked it. He was banned by certain stations for disparaging rock music and sin. Given the notoriety of Jerry Lee, it was ironic. Jimmy pressed on nonetheless. At the age of 29, Jimmy began leading his own crusades in 1964. Nobody supported him. He was seen overly sentimental by churches. He was described as demonic by some. Even when it resulted in debt, he paid for everything himself. He preached and healed in front of 1,000 people in Atlanta. He said he could cure blindness and expel devils. A few folks sobbed and fell on the ground. He was picketed by others. In Georgia, he was detained for disturbing the peace. Even though his shows were drawing 5,000 people per night by 1966, he still owed $10. And had to pawn his equipment to make ends meet. Then everything changed in 1968. God Took Away My Yesterdays is a gospel album that he recorded. It blew up. In a few months, he sold 100,000 copies. He used that money to build his first church in a repurposed warehouse in Baton Rouge. The price was $50,000. It was theirs, even though the walls were thin and the roof leaked. Additionally, he spent $20,000 in a radio station called WLUX and began broadcasting non-stop. The record went gold by 1970. In the midst of the Vietnam War, his anti-drug lectures found their way to youngsters. He warned young people against sin by smashing rock records on stage at various concerts. By 1972, the church had grown quickly from 50 members to 1,000, and that was only the start. Jimmy Swaggart made his television debut with a local program in Baton Rouge in 1973. He invited them to the altar with unadulterated emotion, played the piano like his cousin Jerry Lee Lewis, and spoke with a fiery voice. It had a strong influence. His show was broadcasting in 20 cities nationwide in a matter of months. By 1974, donations were coming in at a rapid pace, totaling $150,000 per month. There were rumors that it appeared to be more of a money-making machine than a ministry. For some, however, it changed their lives. He preached with tears in his eyes every week in front of more than 500,000 people. He had already gotten into arguments with competing preachers by 1976, and those early altercations foreshadowed much more serious problems to come. Swaggart began constructing something even larger in 1975. He inaugurated Baton Rouge's Family Worship Center, a huge church with space for 1,000 worshipers. It soon took center stage in everything he did. The money arrived quickly. He raised almost $1 million from his TV fans in a single year. Additionally, he raised almost $2 million in 2 days, during a well-known telethon in 1976. Some even take out mortgages in order to make donations. With a large choir and pricey lighting, the church was ostentatious and noisy. However, there were fissures behind all the jubilation. He dismissed 15 employees in 1977 when they raised concerns about the way the funds were being managed. His ministry was earning $12 million annually by 1979. Hundreds of thousands were spent on undeclared luxuries, according to later audits. The so-called Holy Church was already concealing its secrets. Swaggart then sent his message abroad in 1978. He began streaming sermons in 10 different languages, using satellite technology. In nations like the Soviet Union and even some areas of communist China, his visage appeared on television. His speech sparked arrests and even violent threats in some Muslim nations, but people continued to observe. Despite efforts to block the transmission, 500,000 people watched in Iran alone. He raised $20 million in donations that year, which was sufficient to purchase pricey mansions and private aircraft. He even performed duets with celebrities such as Dolly Parton. His crew surreptitiously smuggled Bibles into nations that were off-limits. However, this audacious worldwide initiative caused a commotion. His criticism of other religions sparked riots in India. The outcry was intensifying. With 500 students anxious to join what he called God's warriors, he founded Jimmy Swaggart Bible College in 1979. They prayed and studied diligently, sometimes for 12 hours at a time. Anybody who disobeyed, even by enjoying rock music, was kicked out. Like he had once informed his cousin Jerry Lee Lewis, he said that type of music was from the devil. In the same year, Swaggart produced the Grammy-nominated album Worship, which sold over 1 million copies. Although the record brought nearly $5 million, problems were on the horizon. The funds from the church and the college were combining. Additionally, the IRS began investigating $300,000 in odd costs in 1981. Swaggart was still revered by the public, but his personal life was becoming more sinister. Additionally, Swaggart started organizing large-scale crusades around the globe in 1979. One event drew 100,000 people in South Korea. Others claimed to have witnessed miracles, such as blind folks seeing again. In underdeveloped nations, he distributed 10 tons of food and 50,000 Bibles. He gained devotion as a result of his generosity, but others claimed he was buying faith. He was collecting $30 million from the crowds at his performances in 20 countries by 1980. In 1981, 200,000 people attended a rally in Brazil that resulted in traffic bottlenecks throughout the entire city. With loud claims of healing and public exorcisms, his stage performances became increasingly dramatic. Reports soon surfaced, however, that some of the aid funds had disappeared and that some of the miracles had been staged. His kingdom was beginning to fall apart. By 1986, Swaggart's ministry was generating $142 million annually, making it a financial powerhouse. His sermons were heard in more than 100 nations. Sun Life, his radio network, has 200 stations. All around him was his message. The spending was audacious and the money arrived quickly. Swaggart paid his employees $16 million in salary alone in Baton Rouge, lived in opulent mansions, and flew in private jets. However, there was a developing storm behind the strong voice. Every day, donations totaled $500,000. However, a growing number of people began to wonder if it was all true. His empire was trembling by 1987. Scandals were coming quickly. He went back to Brazil for another crusade in 1985. The gathering was significantly larger this time. 200,000 individuals attended. A few said they were healed. As he preached, others started crying. That year, donations reached $120 million, a record high. He attracted larger audiences than most rock stars while touring the nation. 107,000 people attended a 3-day event in Costa Rica. He dubbed it the Miracle of Managua, but there was something sinister lurking beneath the thrill. His private transgressions were exposed in 1988, a mere 3 years later. Swaggart published his novel To Cross a River back in 1984. It described how he became a worldwide preacher after escaping poverty in Louisiana. More than 500,000 copies of the book were sold. It encouraged other pastors to follow in his footsteps. It was inexpensive, but it made a lot of money, millions that he used to expand his business. In 1980, he was nominated for a Grammy and had already sold over 15 million gospel records. He appeared to be a man of God on the outside. However, many viewed the book as a mask, a means of concealing his personal transgressions. When his covert meetings with prostitutes were revealed in 1988, Swaggart targeted another televangelist on live television in 1987. He described Jim Bakker as a horrible person and a disgrace to the church. Bakker was involved in a financial scandal with a woman named Jessica Hahn. Swaggart behaved like the voice of innocence, even criticizing his opponent on CNN. Swaggart's ministry was earning more than $140 million annually at the time. However, nobody was aware that Swaggart had recently expelled Marvin Gorman, another preacher, from the church due to his own scandal. Furthermore, none anticipated that Swaggart would be apprehended with a prostitute in 1988, just 1 year later. Then again in 1991. Swaggart established the Sun Life Broadcasting Network in 1988. Around the world it touched 80 million homes. All day and night, it broadcast gospel music and preaching. Since that first performance in 1973, he had been working for this dream for decades. But it couldn't have come at a worse time. His first prostitution scandal occurred a few weeks after the debut. On national television, viewers watched him sob as he confessed his guilt. Despite a dramatic decline in donations, Sun Life managed to continue. Even as further problems surfaced in the 1990s, he continued to sponsor schools and orphanages. The network was dubbed a miracle by some. Others claimed it was a show business ploy, using the Bible as a cover. Swaggart had been married to Frances for 28 years by 1980. They had tied the knot in a modest ceremony back in 1952. They now resided on a massive estate in Baton Rouge, which had a church on the grounds, private jets, and opulent residences. The ministry provided all of the funding. Their son Donnie became a co-pastor in 1982. According to some, Frances maintained the place's flawless exterior appearance by managing it with an iron grip. But when Jimmy's incident with a prostitute made headlines in 1988, that flawless image was destroyed. By the middle of the 1980s, the facility was home to more than 4,000 churchgoers. But suddenly, there was no trust. Almost constantly, Swaggart preached during those years. He delivered over 200 sermons a year, occasionally passing out from fatigue. By 1987, his wife was in charge of the finances, overseeing more than $150 million annually. Every day, they sent out 7 million letters requesting donations. Rumors of extravagant spending, however, continued to spread behind the scenes. They traveled in a private jet that had once belonged to the Rockefellers and drove matching luxury vehicles. Mink jackets and diamond watches were presented by followers. The IRS started investigating Swaggart's use of ministry cash for personal indulgences in 1986. Later that year, a prostitute would disclose their personal experiences. No longer were the scandals merely rumors. Swaggart criticized rock music on television in 1985, accusing it of being wicked. This led to a strained relationship with his well-known cousins, Mickey Gilley and Jerry Lee Lewis. They had all three been raised in Louisiana. In their younger years, they had all played the piano together. Despite having a similar wild past, Swaggart was now accusing them of wicked music. In the press, Lewis retaliated by denouncing Swaggart as a hypocrite. Swaggart exposed the immorality of another preacher in 1987. However, it was he who was discovered in the company of Deborah Murphy, a prostitute, in 1988. He had made odd requests, she said. The fall was violent and widely reported. Swaggart frequently displayed his family on television. Around 1985, Gabrielle, his grandson, started to appear on youth portions, preaching to children worldwide. It gave the ministry a warm and healthy appearance. However, that reputation was destroyed in 1988 by the Deborah Murphy affair. Donations fell off. Although Donnie Swaggart intervened to assist, the harm had already been done. IRS reports from that year revealed that the organization was using funds to purchase upscale presents and family trips. People now realized that Swaggart was battling for purity, as he had always said. The IRS launched a significant probe into Swaggart's ministry in 1986. They said that between 1978 and 1981, he had evaded paying more than $100,000 in sales taxes. Swaggart claimed on air that he was unfairly singled out. His supporters increased their donations because they trusted him. However, he was under pressure behind the scenes. For Jimmy Swaggart, everything fell apart in 1988. When the startling picture surfaced, everything that he had spent years preaching to millions of people on television fell apart. They showed him and Deborah Murphy, a prostitute, entering room 7 of a budget motel in Metairie, Louisiana. There was more to it than a controversy. It was retaliation. 2 years prior, Swaggart had devastated the life of another preacher, Marvin Gorman, by exposing him for infidelity. Gorman retaliated in February 1988. Overnight, Swaggart's career was ruined by the photos he leaked. Swaggart stood in front of his massive Baton Rouge church on February 21, 1988, and sobbed as he declared, "I have sinned against you." He did not specify what he had done, but everyone knew that one moment was the reason why donations had fallen by 90%. His TV viewership dropped from 2 million to 500,000. He was expelled from the Assemblies of God on April 8 for rejecting their 2-year rehabilitation plan. It would bankrupt him, he added. Swaggart's ministry lost $50 million in that 1 year alone. Buildings were sold, workers were let go, and stations dropped him. Then Deborah Murphy exacerbated the situation. She claimed that for about 24 odd encounters, he paid her between $30 and $40. She said there was no intercourse, but he asked her to perform for him in his Lincoln Town car, talk nasty, and even pose nude. Worst of all, she said, he once requested her daughter, who is 9 years old, to participate. She declined right away. Swaggart claimed that he was unable to stop watching because of childhood trauma. This exposed the man who had condemned so many others. Swaggart attempted to return, however, rather than vanish. Despite being forbidden by the church, he resumed preaching on his own in 1989. Some people continued to believe in him despite the reduced audiences. He published a new novel in 1990 titled The Cup Which He Drank, and it was a big hit. His ministry managed to raise $10 million in that same year. He gave stirring talks about grief and forgiveness while touring in places like Atlanta. Some were moved by his tears and gospel music, while others continued to brand him a hypocrite. His career seemed to take off anew just when everyone feared it was over. However, it was short-lived. He was stopped by police in India, California, on October 11, 1991. On the incorrect side of the road, he was operating his Jaguar. Rosemary Garcia, another sex worker, was in the car with him. He had offered her $10 for sex, she informed the police. It was Swaggart's 56th birthday. He hadn't registered the automobile, wasn't wearing a seatbelt, and had porn mags in the car. Frances, his wife, was in town for church functions nearby. Swaggart didn't cry or say sorry this time. Everyone was surprised when he stepped in front of his church and announced icily, "The Lord told me it's flat, none of your business." His supporters were in disbelief. Donations declined once more. The man who used to make $150 million annually was now being made fun of all around the world. Rosemary Garcia informed reporters that he was crying over his inner issues, trembling, and trying to conceal magazines. "He picked me up from the street and pleaded for help," she added. However, $10 seemed desperate. The Family Worship Center's church attendance plummeted. Annual donations fell to $11 million. The man who used to pack stadiums was suddenly facing rows of vacant seats. He said he needed time to heal, so he gave his son Donnie control of the church. However, a lot of people thought the damage was irreparable. The litigation began in 1992. The donors felt deceived. They claimed that Swaggart had concealed his second controversy while pleading for money. One significant case resulted in a compensation of $1.5 million. In addition, he owed the IRS almost $417,000 in back taxes from the middle of the 1980s. A TV firm owes the ministry more than $34,000, among other arrears. Swaggart rebranded everything as a final resort. In order to prevent more criticism, he shifted his focus from television and started Sun Life Radio Network. His refusal to attend religious services even led to the termination of several of his employees. Things were collapsing inside the ministry. It was evident that the family was having difficulties by 1995. As Jimmy struggled with depression, Donnie assumed greater responsibility. According to those close to him, he talked about decades of shame and wept in private. In an attempt to recover, he formally launched Sun Life Radio across other stations that year. His family, however, was split. Power struggle rumors began to circulate. Swaggart was unable to relax. Church attendance continued to decline, and his gifts remained modest, despite the fact that his body and mind were failing. He continued to deal with Marvin Gorman, the man who had brought him down, in private. Another silent settlement, this time for $185 million, put an end to that feud. Swaggart was a man attempting to hang on, no longer a giant. He took one more daring step in 2000. He established the Sun Life Broadcasting Network, extending Sun Life Radio into television. His sermons were being heard in more than $50 million homes. By 2010, despite everything, he was once again earning $150 million annually. He spoke loudly and bluntly. He forewarned of the end times and labeled other preachers heretics. As a result, he gained popularity among older viewers, despite the disinterest of younger ones. More than 16 million albums of his songs were sold. By 2008, he was sending missionaries to more than 100 countries and spent $20 million annually on international outreach. Critics referred to it as a scandal-based comeback. However, his supporters simply saw a man who refused to give up. Something happened in 2012 that ultimately caused him to slow down. He had a small stroke while preaching at the age of 77. He was partially paralyzed and sent to the hospital. He continued to deliver weekly sermons from Baton Rouge after that, but he no longer traveled on crusades. Gabriel, his grandson, assumed greater responsibility. Swaggart continued to preach despite the doctor's advice. His excessive blood pressure caused him to collapse once more in 2014. Although his audience shrank, he managed to maintain interest in another way. His book To Cross a River, published in 2015, sold 500,000 copies. He said he was being attacked by Satan through sickness. The family was ready for the future when Gabriel was appointed co-pastor in 2016. Swaggart, however, refused to back down. He continued his weekly sermons. Swaggart was 85 when COVID-19 struck in 2020. He said in a home broadcast that the lockdowns were a sign of the end of the world. The vaccine was the mark of the beast, he claimed. Millions of people watched. His web audience increased by 40%. He even amassed 500,000 subscribers on YouTube. However, not everybody was in agreement. Support dropped by 15% as a result of several donors leaving. In November, he contracted CO, but he recovered swiftly. He claimed to have been shielded by God at that precise moment. He tutored his great-grandchildren on Zoom and preached online even during the pandemic. Swaggart was 89 and severely ill by 2024. He suffered from heart issues and pneumonia. He was taken to the hospital in June and placed on a ventilator. Despite everyone's fears that he would pass away, he managed to write one final book. In a few months, 200,000 copies of Where Victory Is were sold. He claimed in the book that his scandals were divine testing. He warned that contemporary churches had become too docile when he appeared on screen with oxygen tubes. He taught the next generation to take over and put $2 million into youth programs. He was now earning $25 million annually from his enterprise, despite the fact that his body was deteriorating. He shattered his hip in a fall at home at the beginning of 2025. He was saw in a wheelchair after that. Then, shortly after Father's Day on June 15, Swaggart passed out from cardiac arrest. He was 90 years old. Until medical help arrived, Donnie and Gabriel attempted CPR. The ICU received him. The physicians indicated there was no brain activity, but the family pleaded for prayers. In the hopes of a miracle that never materialized, the globe watched and waited. Jimmy Swaggart passed away at precisely 7:30 a.m. on July 2025 in Baton Rouge. He had spent more than 2 weeks in a coma. Oddly, the day before, he had been inducted into the Southern Gospel Hall of Fame. His bed was surrounded by his family. A Bible text inspired his parting remarks to the globe. He claimed to have maintained his faith and put up a decent fight. His television network continued to operate. Now gone was the man who had formerly earned $150 million annually. His funeral took place in the Family Worship Center on July 13. Millions more watched online, and more than 5,000 people attended. People wept, preachers spoke, and gospel artists sang. The morning service started and continued until the evening. Only churchgoers and longtime friends were present, not politicians. For hours, thousands of people queued outside to bid farewell. The man who once horrified the world was now seen as both controversial and a symbol of redemption. His final sermon, in which he urged everyone to never give up on grace, was shown on a screen as his journey came to a close.